In 18th century Naples, you could eat a meal you hadn't paid for yet. It was called pizza a otto. Take it now, pay in 8 days. But if you died before those 8 days ran out, the debt got a different name. Locals called it your last supper. That's not folklore, that's how close to the edge an entire class of people were living, in a city that would eventually hand the world its favorite food. Naples in the 1700s was not the postcard you know today. It was choking on its own growth. Under Bourbon rule, the city's population nearly doubled in under 50 years, climbing from around 200,000 people to almost 400,000 by the year 1748. Trade pulled peasants in from the countryside faster than the city could employ them, feed them, or house them. At the bottom of that pile sat around 50,000 people known as the Lazzaroni, a name borrowed from Lazarus because they looked like men risen from the grave. Roughly 1 in 8 Neapolitans lived this way. Porters, runners, day laborers, always moving, always broke. These people needed food that matched their lives, cheap, fast, portable. Street vendors answered with flatbreads sold straight out of wooden boxes carried under the arm or off tin stoves balanced on the head. There was no fixed price and no fixed size. You told the vendor what coins you had and he cut a piece to match. The poorest version came with nothing but lard, garlic and salt. A little more money bought a scrap of horse milk cheese or a few anchovies or fresh basil. This was pizza, but not the pizza you're picturing. No slices, no boxes, no cheese pull, just bread wrapped in paper, eaten walking by people who had almost nothing else. What it didn't have yet was a tomato, because for 200 years, Europe was convinced the tomato could kill you. The fruit crossed the Atlantic from South America in the early 1500s, brought back by Spanish explorers. It belonged to the nightshade family, the same botanical family as a genuinely poisonous plant growing wild across the continent. In 1544, an Italian herbalist named Pietro Andrea Mattioli formally filed the tomato under that same toxic category, and the label stuck. Educated Europe started calling it the poison apple and mostly left it alone. Here's the twist. Wealthy Europeans really did get sick after eating tomatoes, just not for the reason they thought. Their pewter dinnerware was loaded with lead, and the tomato's acidity pulled that lead straight into the food. They blamed the fruit. It was the plate. Meanwhile, the poor ate off simple wood and clay, felt nothing, and kept eating tomatoes because they were cheap and they grew easily in the southern heat. The first known written tomato sauce recipe appeared in 1694 from a Neapolitan chef named Antonio Latini. Proof the poor had already made peace with the fruit the rich were still afraid of. Sometime in the late 1700s, in the slums of Naples, someone laid tomato across that plain flatbread. Nobody recorded the moment. Nobody thought it mattered. But the acid of the tomato against the fat of the local cheese created something the two ingredients couldn't do apart. And modern pizza quietly came into existence, invented by people with no idea they just changed the world's eating habits forever. The rest of Italy wanted nothing to do with it. In 1831, Samuel Morse, yes, the telegraph Morse, visited Naples, tried the local flatbread, and described it as something that looked like bread dragged out of a sewer. 4 years later, novelist Alexandre Dumas toured the same streets and wrote about the Lazzaroni almost like a naturalist, cataloguing an odd species, noting they survived on pizza in winter and watermelon in summer. When Italy finally published its first national cookbooks after unifying in 1861, pizza was left out entirely. Even in books dedicated specifically to Neapolitan food, the dish carried the smell of poverty, and a country trying to build a respectable new identity didn't want that smell anywhere near it. Then, in 1889, a bored queen changed everything. King Umberto I and Queen Margherita of Savoy came to Naples on a royal visit, part of the ongoing effort to make a freshly unified Italy feel like one nation instead of a patchwork of regions. The Queen had been eating French cuisine for every meal because that was what royalty did, and she was tired of it. A local pizza maker, Raffaele Esposito, was summoned and prepared 3 versions for her. One with lard and cheese, one with tiny whitebait, and one with tomato, mozzarella, and basil, red, white and green, matching the new Italian flag. The Queen preferred that third one. Esposito named it in her honor, and Pizza Margherita entered the history books. It wasn't an overnight national conversion. The upper classes didn't suddenly flood the pizza stalls. But royal approval cracked a door that had been sealed for over a century, even as pizza itself stayed stubbornly regional, treated by northern Italians the way a big city diner might treat a roadside snack stand. What actually carried pizza out of Naples wasn't fashion, it was survival. Between 1870 and 1970, more than 26 million Italians left the country looking for work, one of history's largest waves of emigration. Many came from Naples and the surrounding region, and they packed their food traditions into their luggage. In 1897, a baker named Gennaro Lombardi opened a small grocery on Spring Street in Manhattan's Little Italy. It doubled as a gathering spot for Italian immigrants trading news from home. And Lombardi started baking tomato pies in a coal oven on the side, selling them wrapped in paper to factory workers on lunch break. Demand grew so fast that by 1905, the grocery had become a full-time pizzeria, widely credited as the first in the United States. Lombardi had to improvise. No buffalo milk in New York, so cow's milk mozzarella filled in. No wood-fired ovens available, so coal took their place. Those substitutions quietly became the DNA of an entirely new style, the New York slice. His former workers went on to open places of their own, Totonno's in Coney Island in 1924, John's of Bleecker Street in 1929, Patsy's in Harlem in 1933. But outside Italian neighborhoods, America barely knew pizza existed. In 1939, the New York Herald Tribune felt the need to explain the word to readers, spelling it out phonetically so people would know how to say it. That's how foreign it still sounded, barely 80 years ago. The real turning point arrived with a war. When Allied forces landed in Sicily in 1943 and fought their way up the Italian peninsula, hundreds of thousands of American and British soldiers spent months stationed across the south, living on flavorless ration packs. Southern Italy, and Naples especially, had been serving pizza from street stalls for a century and a half. Exhausted, underfed soldiers tasted it for the first time, and it hit differently than anything in a ration tin. When they shipped home, they brought the craving with them, into towns that had never seen a pizza in their lives. Demand outran supply almost overnight. Between 1948 and 1956, oregano sales in the United States jumped by more than 5,000%. Not a trend, a shockwave. Business caught up fast. Shakey's opened in Sacramento in 1954. Two brothers named Dan and Frank Carney borrowed $600 from their mother and opened a restaurant in Wichita, Kansas in 1958, with a sign so small it could only hold 9 letters, which is how the world got the name Pizza Hut. Domino's followed in 1960. Then came frozen pizza, putting a version of the dish into nearly every freezer in the country. Within about 15 years, pizza went from a food most Americans had never heard of to a fixture of Friday nights, birthday parties, and late shifts. By then, it had already split into new regional identities. New York's thin, foldable slice, Chicago's thick-walled deep dish, Detroit's rectangular pie baked in steel pans borrowed from the city's auto factories. And as pizza kept traveling, every country that adopted it rewrote the recipe. Japan tops it with mayonnaise, corn, and potato. France adds a fried egg. Brazil goes with green peas and hearts of palm. India brings paneer and tandoori chicken. Sweden, controversially, puts banana and curry on top. A traditional Neapolitan pizzaiolo would likely wince at most of it, but that adaptability is precisely why a poor man's flatbread became a planetary food. It never demanded loyalty to one version of itself. Today, the numbers are almost absurd. More than 5 billion pizzas are eaten worldwide every year. The United States alone has over 70,000 pizzerias, more than 17% of every restaurant in the country. Roughly 93% of Americans eat pizza in a given month, and 1 in 8 eats it on any given day, averaging around 46 slices a year per person. And in 2017, UNESCO formally added the art of Neapolitan pizza making to its list of humanity's intangible cultural heritage, placing the pizzaiolo's craft alongside things like French gastronomy and the Mediterranean diet. 2 million people had signed a petition to make it happen. When the news landed, pizza makers filled a square in Naples and handed out thousands of free pizzas to celebrate. Sit with that for a second. The same dish Italy's own cookbooks refused to print. The same dish an American inventor once compared to sewer bread. The same food the upper classes spent a century treating as a national embarrassment is now protected, celebrated, and studied as a piece of world heritage. Nothing about pizza's ingredients changed to make that happen. The cheap flour, the feared tomato, the scrap of cheese, none of it got fancier. What changed was who was finally willing to eat it. For 200 years, pizza was judged by the people who ate it, not by how it tasted. The moment that stopped, an entire planet found out what the poorest people in Naples had known the whole time.